Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Elena Lyon. I'm chair of Department of Political Science and International Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the campus of University of New Hampshire this evening. I want to do a quick shout out to some of the partners here on the campus that helped us make this happen tonight. So the Model United Nations students and the leadership, Abigail Smart, who's here, so thank you very much, and to the International Affairs Program, who also helped co-sponsor. So we're delighted to have the World Affairs Council on campus and to bring us Ambassador Lavin. But let me introduce to you Davis Farmer from the World Affairs Council, who will talk a little bit about their work and introduce the ambassador.
I'm Davis Farmer. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're an organization that was founded, our particular chapter was founded just, 70 years ago last year. And our mission is essentially to put on programming that tells, informs people about international events and international affairs that have an impact on the United States. So our job is to try to inform people about things that they wouldn't necessarily know about otherwise. And there are a few bullet points that I have to say. We're a nonpartisan organization. We are certainly not for profit. That's apparent to us most days. We don't take positions, but we try to present as many, the different sides of given topics, and to be fair and balanced in the programming. We're delighted to have Ambassador Lavin with us tonight, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Tim Horton, our executive director, to introduce the ambassador and to run the program.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. Thank you to the University of New Hampshire for hosting us here. We actually were founded 71 years ago on this campus, and was housed here for about 50 years before moving over to the Manchester area. So we have a long history with bringing international conversations here to campus. And thank you all for joining us here tonight, either in person, online, or watching the recording. We believe this is going to be a fascinating conversation. Frank has promised me as such, so if it's not, blame him, not me. But we're really excited to have someone with such a distinguished career in foreign affairs, and someone who has an intimate knowledge to the Reagan White House, having served in various roles for pretty much all of 8 years. Even though he didn't vote for Reagan the first time around. But I'll let him answer that later. But we're excited to have the ambassador. The ambassador was ambassador to Singapore. He worked in the Commerce Department, and these days he's filling his time teaching over out in California at the University of Southern California. And a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution as well. So thank you, Ambassador, for coming tonight. So you wrote a book, right? And we have it here for sale tonight for anyone who is interested. You can buy it online on Amazon or wherever people buy books these days. But you wanted to, in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, to take a look at the state of politics in the United States, and really look at what is going on, and what lessons we can learn from a different time, maybe an equally chaotic time, the 1980s. So can you tell us just a little bit about what your initial experiences in the White House were, and why you wanted to write this book?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Thank you for the welcome. Thank you to the audience, the UNH students, the WAC members. It's great. Thank you, Alana and Davis, for your gracious words and opening eyes. So it's fun. It's great to be here. It's great to talk about the book, talk about the 80s in American government, American politics, and so forth. Look, what I tried to do is provide an examination of sort of the White House leadership process and how do successful presidents, and I would put Reagan in that category, how do they perform, and what kind of duties and tasks do they have to undertake in order to move their agenda ahead. So I'm trying to look at politics from sort of a rationalist perspective. What kind of country do you want? What kind of society do you want? What kind of economy helps us? And what kind of policies do we put in place to get there? And how does a president provide leadership? And to my mind, the twin aspects of leadership is you have to be able to articulate a vision. You have to be able to tell the country where you're trying to go. And then you have to be able to create a consensus for action. You have to be able to operate with some kind of support in the legislative branch. And for most of Reagan's presidency, he didn't have more than one of the two chambers behind him. Usually the House was, Democrat Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House. So you had to be able to reach the public and speak to more moderate Democrats who might be somewhat sympathetic to you. And this would be a series of case-by-case iterations where you have shifting coalitions. And so you have to respect everybody, because somebody might be against you for 3 votes in a row and they'll vote with you in the 4th vote. So don't denigrate people, don't stigmatize people, but always try to be inviting and try to have as broad a coalition as you can so you can advance your agenda.
Yeah, no, that's great. So many of our audience members here today were not alive at this time. So can you talk to us a little bit about what the world and the United States was facing in the 1980s?
Yeah.
Bring it home for
Yeah,
our
let me
audience here.
take a minute. Thank you for that, Tim. Let me take a minute and put it in context. I had a chance to visit with Alana's class earlier today. We talked a little bit about it, but it was Cold War architecture was the main format for foreign policy. The main challenge faced by the United States was the Soviet Union, its allies, the Warsaw Pact, and its opportunism or adventurism in the Third World, and the United States' efforts to push back or deflect or correct or support our allies in the Third World. So yeah, talk a minute about what that entailed, and then about what Reagan's contribution was, and then where we are today. And the sentence that I think sort of describes, encapsulates the question of U.S. foreign policy, both as the Cold War became underway, and also we facing the same question today, is do you want to be a minute early or do you want to be a minute late? Do you want to have a foreign policy that anticipates and prepares for challenges and requires an expenditure, both an expenditure of political allocation of personal activity, but also direct expenditure of funds, or do you want to be a minute late? And for most of U.S. history, we decided it's a lot smarter to be a minute late. So for most of U.S. history, there's no particular U.S. international role or aspiration or foreign policy. Foreign policy was essentially a clerical undertaking. If something happened, we responded to it. But there wasn't a design by the United States or view of the United States' role in the world. And indeed, we were proud, I think with some justification, to say we were not part of the European colonial experiment. For the most part, that it didn't hold true of the Philippines and some other activity of the U.S., but in general, we were not a colonial nation or not imperialist nation, and the Europeans were competing around the world, and we were content not to be part of that. So we had no standing army. We did have a standing navy. We had no treaty, no military alliances, no formal legal allies in any sense of the word, no U.S. troops stationed overseas. So we weren't a part of it. We weren't part of it. And you say, boy, you save a lot of money. You save a lot of money if you do that. And I would say being a minute late is the best choice. It is the right choice as long as nobody ever presents a bill, because you're allowing for risk if you don't have a standing army. Well, the bill was presented. The bill was presented in December 1941. And I think Japanese leadership said they don't have anything. There's nothing they can do to us. So we can push them out of the Philippines. We can push them out of Asia. So why don't we do it? So that precipitated U.S. entry into World War II. But starting with World War II and on through the Cold War, we saw a series of programs and policies in place, the most important of which were formal military alliances, that we said, look, if you're facing a struggle, if you're in a war, you want friends, and you want as many friends as you can find. And some are formal allies that you're doing operational activity with. Others are like-minded nations where you still have a convergence of activity. You can still use as force multipliers. So having formal military alliances was absolutely key to prevailing in World War II. Forward deployment, where we put U.S. forces overseas on a permanent basis. And that was part of a World War I to World War II lesson, meaning when the Allies prevailed in World War I, we told ourselves, with maybe some validity, our job is done. Our job is done. We don't want any part of this European entanglement. So there's no need to occupy Germany. There's no need to help the German economy. There's no need to be a part of this. And same thing with the Soviet Union. We see these fellows are on a different trajectory. We don't need to be part of it. But that became a calamity as the rise of dictators in Europe in the interwar years. It became an enormous problem for the United States. So we said we're not going to make that mistake. We're going to have an army of occupation. We're going to work on the economies of these countries. We're going to do what we can to formally involve ourselves to establish democracies in Japan and Germany and Italy. And that carried over to Cold War architecture, where all of those programs came into place. There were additional elements of that. Global messaging was part of World War II that carried over Cold War, meaning we had no particular message to the world before World War II. The president never spoke to the global population, but we realized it's a battle of ideas in World War II, that Germany and Japan and Italy are holding themselves out as a better way of life, a better friendship, and making that argument that countries need to align themselves with them, and we needed to talk about democracy and rule of law and what we were proposing as well. So that global messaging came intact. We believed we had the moral high ground because we're a democracy and the communists are a dictatorship, so that was an important element of it. And also, it was a World War II element. I think it became more prominent in the Cold War, promoting insurgencies or groups that were opposed to the dictatorship. So in World War II, we're supporting underground movements and armed movements in countries that are occupied by our enemies. And in Cold War, we did that to different degrees of success, different degrees of intensity. Reagan's contribution, so all U.S. presidents more or less adhered to what I just described, some with more robust views, some not more tepidly, but everybody understood the Soviet Union presented a threat to the United States, and there had to be some mechanism for the United States to push back. Reagan's contribution, I think, was that the center of gravity when he took office, there was a particular version of this Cold War policy called containment. So the center of gravity was containment, and containment was we are stuck. We are stuck in this open-ended competition with the Soviets, and anything beyond that is risky because they're nuclear power. Any escalation on our part could have consequences. So all we can do is hold the line. All we can do is hold the line and make sure the Soviets don't advance anymore. But that's as far as our policy goes. And that was a generally accepted approach to the Cold War. Reagan said, I've got a different idea, that we prevail, that our economy is stronger than the Soviet economy, our technology is better, our message is better, we have the moral high ground, so we can win. We can win. Reagan said, instead of containment, we need to roll back or push back the dictatorships and allow space for democracy. So let's raise the cost of Soviet adventurism, let's put them under economic pressure, and let's see what we can do. And that was a lot of the Reagan presidency in the 1980s. I would say that Cold War architecture and Cold War policies remained intact for a good 10 plus years after the end of the Cold War. We'll just say the Cold War, you could say it ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990 or the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it ended in the early 90s. But nonetheless, as you went through the 90s, I think you had all the mechanisms still in place. People weren't 100% sure if the Soviet Union was gone, and you're habituated. You're habituated to a certain kind of behavior in any event. But by the time you get to the 2010s, you have a view that maybe we don't need Cold War mechanisms, Cold War architecture, the way we needed them in the Cold War. And I would say we've had now 3 presidents in a row who are skeptical of that Cold War approach or see greater cost and fewer benefits. And I mean Obama, Biden, and Trump, all similar in some respects, but obviously stylistically very, very different. But all of them questioning the wisdom of why we need to play this kind of global leadership role, and wouldn't our security be better enhanced if we actually did less overseas? So the swing, it's not a binary choice. It's not like we've abandoned one position and adhere to the other, but at an incremental basis, there's definitely been movement, Tim, from let's be a minute early to we don't have to always be a minute early, do we? We can be a minute late. We don't need to play the leadership role that we've been playing for 60 or 70 years. and we can dial that back. So we've seen a back, if you will, of U.S. positions around the world over 3 presidents now. And my view is be careful. Be careful, because you are making it easy for people who are adventurous or opportunist or even malevolent. You're making it easier for them to prevail, and you're setting the stage up for bad news. So that's the core message.
Great. We'll get more to modern day, but I have a few more questions about Reagan so that we can figure out what lessons we can learn. You talked a little bit about the Cold War architecture, and mainly that, not entirely, but mainly that focused on national security, on hard power. Can you talk to any what Reagan's interests were in the world beyond military power?
No, by the way, thank you for that, because you are absolutely correct that soft power, I mentioned not just being a democracy, but what served the U.S. well was a view, again, I think across all U.S. presidents, that we needed to behave in such a way that we became the most inviting partner for countries who might be more neutral or might not be oriented to the U.S. But if we had several significant advantages in this contest. One, we had no territorial ambitions, so we could always be a safe partner to work with, because we weren't looking for extra territory or to conquer territory or subjugate somebody. So we had that sort of moral high ground. Two, economically in particular, we were rules based. So we were a great trading partner, investment partner, and so forth. That you could, if you had a dispute with a U.S. company, you could certainly sue in a U.S. court. You would get a fair hearing. So we became a very inviting trade and economic partner for a lot of countries. I also think there's a lot of fascinating soft power elements of this, Tim. The university system we have in the U.S. and the ability to attract foreign students, tourism itself. So the U.S. held a certain attraction that I think was enormously helpful in building friendships and relationships around the world.
Yeah, the shining city on the hill speech. Speaking of economics, I think this is one of the areas that today we are having a lot of conversations around with the rise of tariffs and all of that. Can you talk to us a little about how Reagan approached the world in terms of trade and economics?
Yeah, Reagan believed in market economics, that the most prosperous, most successful societies in the world respect the marketplace and allow people to do what they want to do. So you have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can undertake whatever economic activity you want to take. I mean, you can't hurt anybody, but you have broad freedoms, and that does allow for the most prosperous results. But that, if you believe that, that holds true regardless of whether the provider is domestic or international, that the more economic activity you can undertake, the more good news you're going to have. So Reagan very much agreed with liberalization and allowing foreigners to sell into the U.S. market and the U.S. to sell into foreign markets. It was typically incremental, in not just because of U.S. politics. There's a finite appetite for this, but also the foreign counterpart. They have the same set of political dynamics we have. That everybody understands at a sort of philosophical level that liberalizing allows more space for good news. But you're going to be dislocating potentially domestic service providers, so you need to move step by step, and you need to be able to take people with you. But that was an important part of Reagan presidency. If you look now at U.S. per capita income compared to per capita income of advanced countries who did not liberalize, and Europe was really lag behind us, it's an extraordinary difference. I mean, U.S. is, when we say it's the wealthiest industrialized country in the world, it's true. It's not, but it's not 10% wealthier than France or 20% wealthier. It's 100% wealthier than France. And I remember looking at a statistic when somebody broke down state-level GDP. Different states had different income, and I think the worst state, so to speak, the poorest state on a per capita GDP basis was Mississippi, and Mississippi was ahead of Canada. So you'd say if Canada were part of the U.S., it would be number 51. So the point is, it's been an enormous success. But as people have commented, there can be dislocation, there can be grievances, and there can just be stratification, meaning people don't necessarily have to be worse off to have a feeling of grievance. If everybody else is moving ahead faster than they are, and they're moving ahead more slowly, they can still have a sense of somehow missing out, or that liberalization didn't help them. And that happens with technology sometimes, that happens with trade, that as societies move ahead, as economies move ahead, there can be stratification, and you have to be able to manage that. So we have an undercurrent of unhappiness because of this, but overwhelmingly, a majority of Americans do not support the new tariffs. They are against tariffs. The tariffs impoverish us.
And then the final thing before we sort of jump ahead a little bit here, and then we'll bring in audience questions as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about Reagan's approach to interacting with the world? We see a very different style these days than perhaps traditionally. Yeah. How did he view his interactions with foreign leaders?
You know, it's a little bit like my comment before about Tip O'Neill and the Democratic congressman. Say, look, every country in the world has its own politics, its own personalities, its own history, its own needs, its own desires, its own goals, and respect that. Respect that, and you can't simply say what we need in diplomacy is homogeneity, or what we need in diplomacy is some kind of a Stalinist, identity where everybody must agree with us. In fact, I think you'd say our starting point is typically the opposite. Let's respect all of these differences, but let's capture as much goodwill as we can. So if a country agrees with us on half the issues, we'd say that's great. Let's work together on those half the issues, and maybe over time, there'll be some accumulated learning, and we'll go from 50% agreement to 60% agreement, right? But don't view 50% agreement as a loss or a failure. Capture the good news when you can capture it, and work with people whenever there's that convergence of view. So it's sort of open architecture and a recognition of the divergence of people's opinion.
Okay, so jumping ahead to modern day, and certainly if people have questions about Reagan specifically, we'll happily get to those in a moment. But we see the Trump administration wanting to take on the mantle of Reaganism in many of ways, talking about peace through strength, talking about various maxims that President Reagan utilized. Quickly. Yeah. As much as you can. What are the comparisons? What are they getting right? What are they missing? And what can they do better?
Well, by the way, I'm not surprised if Reagan, or for that matter, Bill Clinton, said, I agree with Reagan on some approach, or I'm trying to do something. That's not surprising, because Reagan left office with something like 68% approval or something. So, but I think there's significant differences between Trump's approach. I mean, that minute early approach says we improve our security by having friends. We improve our security by having allies. And there's a cost to that, because not every friend delivers the way you want, and some friend might publicly disagree with you, and you're managing, it's horizontal management, where we don't directly tell a European country or tell Japan what to do, but we think we can collaborate with them and create a mechanism so that they see it in their interest to work with us. So there's a high degree of collaboration, but there's going to be divergences, and there's going to be cost issues and other. So it does require management. But boy, that was Reagan's approach, and that was, I think, every president's approach from Pearl Harbor through the end of. I think Trump just has a very different view, that friends are expensive, friends are costly, and they're going to say things or do things that might diverge from you, or you're going to get pulled into some kind of conflict that you don't want, and so it has less appeal to him. And it was striking to me the chemistry between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, for example, the chemistry between George W. Bush and Tony Blair, the chemistry between Harold Macmillan and John F. Kennedy, that American presidents would develop affinities for certain foreign leaders. It tended to be British prime ministers, not surprisingly, and I can't think of any friend the president has who's a foreign leader now. So I think that's not a positive sign.
So one of the things that we saw throughout the 1980s for the United States was support in the name of containment. And it wasn't just the 80s, it happened before then as well, but supporting right-wing dictators, especially across Latin America, Pinochet being the prime example. We see today many people claiming that President Trump is cozying up to authoritarians, China, Russia, etc., Kim Jong-un. So what's the difference? Is there a difference? How do we manage this this contradiction?
Yeah, well, first, the principle or premise of diplomacy is it makes sense to talk to people. Not it makes sense to talk to people you like, or it takes talk to people who agree with you, but it makes sense to talk to people in general. and you better be able to have a conversation even with someone you don't like. But then when you have a dictatorship, the question becomes the saying, do we move that dictatorship toward democracy or toward some respect to human rights by engaging with them or by isolating them? What's the approach? And those are the sort of two philosophical approaches. Is it oxygen or is it asphyxiation? So what happens? And Reagan's view was, if it's a personality-led dictatorship, there's a huge argument for, meaning it's not a ideology, but it's Franco in Spain. There's a huge argument for engagement because that fellow is going to leave the stage, and there's no organizing ideology behind him that can perpetuate that dictatorship. And there's going to be a hunger among leadership and among the middle class for more freedom. And what you have to do is provide an off-ramp. You have to provide some kind of exit from the dictatorship, so you're not building your engagement on denigrating them, or we're going to put you all in jail, or the sooner we overthrow you, the better. You're simply saying, let's have an orderly transition to a more open political system. And that worked in Chile, where they moved to democracy. It worked in Spain and Portugal. They moved to democracy. In Greece, we had the colonel's coup. This was before Reagan, and that moved back to democracy. But both South Korea and Taiwan were autocratic systems, and they both moved to democracies. So there was a fair amount of progress in these personality-led dictatorships where the system did move democratic. So you'd say, boy, that's a strong argument for engagement, and not simply saying what I want with a dictatorship is friction and my goal is to publicly sort of insult them. That's emotional release. And by the way, it might be very well deserved, but that's not a policy. That's not saying that's not statecraft. Where are we trying to take the country? Where are we trying to take that country? That's simply me saying, let me give a press conference of what I don't like about the world today. It'd say, well, you can do that, but you're not helping anybody necessarily. So what's interesting is that the Leninist governments haven't really shown an ability to reform. So Cuba is still a dictatorship. North Korea is still a dictatorship. And back to the similarities between our recent presidents, Obama says, look, I'm going to meet with Castro. I'm going to see what I can do. This is not helpful that it's been a dictatorship this long. We've been estranged from them. We have economic boycott. I'm going to meet with them, and we're going to see if we can close some gaps. But he did more or less what Trump said about North Korea. You know, this is, how much sense does this make that we're isolating North Korea? Let's find a way to work with them, and we can offer economic engagement. We can do all sorts of things, and we're not a bad partner for these guys. Well, both were unsuccessful. I mean, the point is, for whatever reason, Cuba and North Korea remain a dictatorship or remained estranged from the United States. It is not from lack of United States engagement or lack of U.S. efforts. This is what columnist Charles Krauthammer would deride as the broken telephone theory of diplomacy. The only reason we have bad relations is because the telephone was broken. So if we just make a phone call to this fellow and approach them in goodwill, that they'll respond, and we'll have. And so you're imputing a level of rationalism that might not exist.
Okay, I have two more questions before we'll bring in the audience questions. My first one is more broad picture. My second one will be a little bit more focused. Broad picture. The question we came to when we first started talking about this event is answering the question of, does U.S. engagement in the world matter? Is it in our interest? And if so, why? So what are your thoughts in that space?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely central for our security to provide leadership, even though there's a cost to leadership and there's going to be friction to leadership, and you're going to make mistakes in leadership. So you're going to get some things wrong, and there'll be misallocation of funds. But boy, you become the organizing principle for like-minded nations. Other democracies say we've got to calibrate our activity with the U.S. in mind, because they're our best friend and they're our best partner, and we like working with these guys. So you end up leading a sizable coalition that can be very useful in dissuading, international opportunism or misadventure or bad behavior. And we've said, look, that role is too expensive. We don't want to play that role. And we have opportunistic nations. I don't think they're necessarily looking for broader conflicts, but you're shifting the window of acceptable activity internationally, and I think in a harmful way. So we're in an era where there aren't working leadership coalitions that will push back against aggression. And there was a foreign policy term, Fritz Kramer pioneered, provocative weakness, that you are inducing bad behavior by not showing strength. And I'm afraid that's where we are.
And then in your book, you write about how Reagan, it takes, 30 years or so before we can honestly answer the question of whether or not a president was good. Initially, it's you're either for the president because you like their policies, or you're against them because there's no way they can do a good job because they have the wrong policies. Are we seeing a bit of that with President Trump today? And what do you think the history books will write 30 years from now?
Yeah, I think your premise is accurate, that almost without exception, I mean, we try this with your friends, with your family members, almost without exception, if you ask somebody who is in public life today, well, what do you think of this person? Almost without exception, the response is based on the person who's asked personal agreement with that person. So if you say, did Hillary Clinton do a good job or a bad job as Secretary of State, they're not going to say, well, here's her strong points and weak points. They're not going to. What they're going to say is, I can't stand Hillary Clinton, or I really like Hillary Clinton. So all they're doing is projecting their personal preferences, their personal appetite onto the question. So you really don't get an evaluation of, that was my question. My question was not, what is your personal opinion of this individual? My question is, what is the Secretary of State supposed to do? How would you define a person does a superb job, and did Hillary Clinton hit that mark or not? Right, so it's a very different question. But after the person has left the public stage, and after a decade or a few decades have passed, I think you do get a more balanced view about what was that person's ultimate contribution. And I came up with 3 for Reagan: that he moved from containment to prevailing against the Soviets. Secondly, he was the first this theory of welfare state and expansive government programs, is it too large, and at some point the benefits taper, and at some point maybe there's even second order effects that are actually harmful. So this sort of conservative critique of large government had always existed, but we never had a president who had sort of challenged that. So Reagan was the first person to say, we might not be helping somebody who's been on welfare for 10 years if our only message to that person is, we'll get ready for year 11. There might be long-term second-order effects for somebody. There might be such a phenomenon as welfare dependency, and maybe we need to look at other programs. And his third contribution, interestingly, was sort of mechanical. I mean, it was a one-off contribution. It was very interesting that that's not me, is it?
No, you're
okay,
good.
thank you. Thank you. A U.S. vice president had not directly succeeded a U.S. president in an election in over 150 years. It's a very hard act. It's a little counterintuitive because we think naturally a sitting vice president is viewed in somewhat the same vein the sitting president is viewed, and if the sitting president is viewed favorably, the vice president will be too, and we're going to see a natural succession. But it almost never happens in U.S. history. So my third area I discuss in the book is why doesn't it happen often, and what did Ronald Reagan have to do to support his vice president, George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, for president. So those were sort of 3 lasting elements of his presidency. How will Trump be viewed? I think, first of all, my premise comes right into play because he has such a theatrical presence. He has such a strong personality and sort of very robust language that it's hard sometimes to try to evaluate, but what is the policy dimension of what you're saying? Because we're just fixated on his exact words, or he loves sort of denigrating people, and he uses sort of friction as a management tool, so he likes sort of exuding friction. But if you say, well, let's put all of that aside and say, what has he actually done? Has he helped or hurt U.S. security? I think you do have to wait a few decades. And my fear, as I indicated in my opening remarks, is look, you're giving room to nations that are not acting in good faith. You're giving them room to maneuver and grow in a way that historically we always viewed as harmful to U.S. interest, and you're not maintaining and cultivating these significant friendships and alliances U.S. has built up over decades, which is you never know when there's going to be bad weather, and it's not a bad idea to cultivate friendships. So I suspect we pay a price for this, but again, it has to be some external action has to precipitate it. Somebody has to present a bill. So right now you could say this ill will is cost-free. And I guess, we can all think on a human scale here, what harm is done in a family quarrel? Well, no harm's necessarily done. I don't think it's a good idea. And there's no need to go through life stepping on toes or creating ill will when you have the capacity to create goodwill. But maybe no harm is done until something happens at some point, and then all of a sudden there's consequences for all of this ill will. So that's my concern.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. I'll open it up to audience questions. If you're watching online, we're happy to take your questions. I am on my phone, not checking sports scores or the latest TMZ reports. I am checking for your questions via email or in the YouTube chat function. So I'll open it first to people in the audience, or we can get started with. And if you have a question, do wait for the microphone so our online audience can hear. See how far this reaches. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your very provocative and really interesting assessment of the leadership. And I will say, managed to cover about 70 years of U.S. foreign policy in about 20 minutes, so I'm impressed, very much so. I have a couple questions, and some of them really just about Reagan himself and the legacy of Ronald Reagan. So, during the Reagan administration, you have the fall of the Soviet Union. It starts to crumble, and I was in graduate school, and I remember my faculty member, at one point, I was in a course called Sovietology that did exist, and at one point he took the syllabus and tore it into little teeny pieces and threw it up in the air. And so my first question is, you had a front row seat to one of the most profound events in world politics and U.S. foreign policy in 100 years. And so I'd like to know a little bit about that. And then the second piece for me, is about his vice president. So as a student of foreign policy myself, I think George H.W. Bush is one of the most underrated presidents in terms of, quote, leadership. And that's partly because he had to deal with the fall of the Soviet Union. And then all of a sudden you have these former Soviet republics that have nuclear capacity with potential instability. And there is a potential within the United States and Western allies to, quote, dance on the wall, to celebrate at that particular moment. And many point out that Bush actually didn't dance on the wall. He didn't do the spike the ball in the touchdown end zone, and very quietly managed a very complex situation. So I just wonder whether or not your assessment is the same. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Look, Reagan sort of had an intuitive sense that containment wasn't sustainable permanently, and it also lacked a moral dimension, meaning to get into this, to say we're going toe-to-toe with a dictatorship that is predatory and opportunistic, it doesn't respect human rights, and produces a lot of misery for its citizens. We should have in our hearts to prevail over this, and that some of the World War II mentalities, not just that Japan and Germany are military threats to us, but they represent terrible systems and terrible outcomes. So we need to find some way to push back against them. And the hardest part, I think, initially was taking that point I made about creating a consensus. How do we take the American people with us, and how do we take European leaders with us? And everybody's got a different perception of risk and a different appetite for change. And so one other definition of leadership, I think this was Kissinger, said a leadership is a person who can take a society from one point of equilibrium to a second point of equilibrium. But in between those 2 points, that journey can have some tumult in it and have some questions in it. Not everybody's on board. But over time, over several years, the military buildup and the increased pushback on the Soviets seemed to work. So over time it had an effect, but in the initial stages there's an enormous Soviet response to U.S. arms buildup, that Reagan is a warmonger, that he's spending money we don't have, that he's a cowboy, that he's a nuclear nut, that he's a militarist. So enormous sort of quote-unquote peace movement in Europe against U.S. force buildup, and it becomes politically contentious, right? But by always using diplomacy and reassuring your allies and engaging with them and speaking, I think, in a pretty effective way to the American people, you can say this is the path we're going down. So he prevailed, so to speak. At the point of transition, as the Soviet Union was crumbling, I think it was Brent Scowcroft that said no dancing on the wall. So there was enormous discipline in the U.S. system. There's no triumphalism. We know we won, you lost. We know that. But you don't have to say it. You have to say that and let that structure and that system retain its dignity. And don't stigmatize or denigrate somebody because they're an adversary. So the Soviets certainly was an adversary, had a million problems with them, but it doesn't mean we woke up in the morning saying we hate Mikhail Gorbachev. In fact, we'd say there's a level of professionalism in Gorbachev, and he's got a level of legitimacy in his system, and actually having some kind of working relationship with this guy is going to be beneficial. So the point of victory, if you will, the point of prevailing, if you will, is to try to take society, take the world the place you want it to go. It is not to point fingers at or to insult somebody else who you might not care for. Gorbachev had considerable value in that system. And by the way, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin, I think, understood and accepted this evolution. We had no territorial aspirations. We weren't saying we're going to cut the Soviet Union in half or we're going to put a U.S. general in charge of occupation forces. We're saying we don't want any of that. We want Soviet to no longer exercise hegemony in Eastern Europe. We want Poland and Hungary and the other nations to be free and choose to make their own political choices. But we respect Russia as a participant in the international system. And Russia has long been a major power, a great power. In the 19th century, it was one of the leading nations. And we have no particular objection. So it's not an anti-Russian or an anti-nationalist initiative. And I think so we proposed, this was in the Bush administration, after Reagan, the Bush administration, that we said, well, let's change the G7 meeting to a G8. Let's invite Russia into that. We also proposed and carried through, let's invite Russia into the WTO, the successor organization to the GATT. It's a world trading nation. Let's invite them in and have them participate on the same basis as every other nation. So the point was, include Russia in the process and provide public goods and architecture to Russia, and that induces them to perform in a system. By the way, that worked very well until Putin came to power. And Putin came to power with a grievance mentality that a great injustice had been done, and his mission on this planet is to restore Russian greatness, and the way to do that is territorial aggrandizement and subjugating his neighbors. I mean, it's an odd view of the world, but he's on this mission to carry that out.
Yeah, Sue.
Yes, my name is Sue Tatton. I'm a former USAID diplomat, and actually I was a Peace Corps volunteer.
Oh, that's great.
During the Reagan era.
That's super. What country?
Botswana.
Oh, that's great.
Wonderful.
So you worked with
country.
Jonathan Miller?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Jonathan's a good friend.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
the Peace Corps director.
He was
Yep.
country director.
He was.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
He was the director when I was brought there, yeah.
Yep, good.
So my question is, I'm also a human rights lawyer.
Great.
So I feel like I'm under attack. And everything that I've worked for is under attack over the last 9 months. So my question is, is there any hope for the American public and this administration to understand the importance of soft diplomacy and respect for human rights? Because I definitely don't see that. So my question is, where is that whole? It's something that I've been proud as an American to be able to represent.
Yeah.
And it's disappointing that is no longer the case.
Yeah. Well, Sue, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your questions. I know it was at AID too, so we have at least two former AID people here. Look, my view is we are throwing away a lot. We are throwing away a lot. That AID and the Peace Corps had very useful roles in the third world, not just helping these local economies, local governments try to operate better, but it's also the hand of friendship. And we forget we're a generation or two removed from post-World War II decolonization, but a lot of international activity in the 1950s and 1960s was defined by the retreat of the European colonial powers and the advent of decolonization. And in that time, communists had an appeal. There were indigenous groups that could be communist affiliated that were not surprisingly anti-colonial, and they had a certain appeal. So I think our premise was accurate. Not only is helping with economic development and helping societal changes in the Peace Corps useful and good display of altruism, but we're also creating a safeguard, a bulwark of society that is not going to be enticed by a communist message for a better world, sign up with us. So it was a powerful diplomatic tool as well as the right thing to do. I think it is just a mistake to shut that down or to throw it away. I think it's a mistake. You can always say it's a different world now. There's more affluence. We don't need it in quite the same way we did. I agree with that. But that's very different than saying we don't want it or we don't need it. It's just saying it plays a different role now than it historically had been. But I think the premise is absolutely correct that the more you have social cohesion, the more that the populations think this society is basically fair, this economy is basically functional, and I can have a better life, or my kids can have a better life if we participate in the system, the more you're drawing people away from extremism and violence. So it's in our interest to have successful societies in the third world, and if we say it's none of our business, watch out, watch out. You are opening the door for radical or violent organizations to play a bigger role in those societies. So I'm very sympathetic to your point. I don't know that we'll have the leadership to get back. I just don't think Donald Trump has much of an interest in it. I think he just says it was all cost, it was no benefit, it was sort of charity work, but who cares kind of point, and he's pulled the plug. So it's unfortunate. And I kind of go back to my Pearl Harbor point is, as long as the system is stable and productive, maybe it doesn't matter. But if there's an insurgency or a malevolent force or a violent political movement in that society, a pandemic, there's all sorts of bad scenarios that can take place. And if we're indifferent to it, you're giving that bad scenario room to run. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Shay. I'm a political science and international affairs student here at UNH. So you talked a little bit about the U.S. continuing global leadership, something I myself am very interested in. I'm hoping to get into a career of diplomacy.
Yay. Do it.
Obviously, it's something that is decreasing right now under the Trump administration, but also something we're seeing that clearly voters are feeling maybe a little bit fatigued in terms of global leadership with the U.S. So if an administration in the future that is interested in regaining global leadership and assisting other nations does come into power, what are ways that they can find that balance of both pleasing maybe American voters that aren't as enthusiastic about global leadership while also ensuring that the U.S. is still, maybe doing their due diligence in terms of the global community?
Well, I think we need to see some, honest communication with the American voters about the cost and the benefit of American leadership, and to say, I understand people don't intrinsically like the cost to it, but there's considerable benefit as well. And if you allow it to decay and you don't have friends when you want them, you don't have relationships when you want them, you are going to pay a price. And I would say the same phenomenon on the economic side with trade, that if we are viewed as the best trading partner, the best economic partner around the world, there's enormous benefit. We were talking early, and I said there's different answers to the question about what's special about America or what makes America work. But at least in an economic sense, part of what makes America work is America is the best place in the world to have an idea. And anybody in the world who's got an idea thinks at some point about bringing it to America. So our economy has the best innovation, the best tech sector, the best venture capital sector, the best financial sector of any country in the world. That just gives us enormous success economically. Be careful about diminishing that. Be careful about being less of an open society, or less what we would say historically is we really don't care where you came from. We care about the value of your idea, and the market determines it. If people like it and want it and use it, I guess it's a good idea, right? And but we're open to it. You can try anything you want, and you can see if you can make it work. So I would say don't give that up. That's a fantastic position. And the problem with the sort of nationalism is there can be a insular side to it or a chauvinistic side to it that says we we best help our own country if we don't engage economically with the world, and if we wall off, and somebody who's selling something to us or investing or doing something with us is maybe hurting us, which I think is grossly inaccurate, right? But there's a price you pay for that, because you're telling that person that idea, you better go someplace else and don't bring it to us. And if it's not invented in the U.S. or made in the U.S. or started in the U.S., we don't want it, which I think really takes us down the wrong path.
And to the cost of international engagement, depending on which metrics you use and what you include, we were spending less than 1% and closer to 0.5% of the U.S. budget on all foreign engagements. That's a point that I like to remind people of. But we have a question here as well.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry I'm late. Let me know if you've already talked.
Oh.
Let me know if you've already talked
Sure.
about this. I am an international affairs and physics major.
Great.
There are so many questions I want to ask, but I want to work in the State Department or with the UN.
Yeah.
As you said, you were working under Reagan, meaning you were working slightly in the Cold War era.
Right.
What I am very interested in space politics. So, what was your experience with the international side of the space race with our allies?
Yeah. That, by the way, that was a key part of one of the points I did make a few minutes ago, a point about what advantages the U.S. have in that Cold War setting that Reagan said we need to capitalize on these strengths. One was general economic performance. We just had a better performing economy. But one element of that was technology, to say we can outpace these guys, they cannot keep up. But to the space element, that was the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is a U.S. defense program to say we can intercept Soviet ICBMs, so we can intercept Soviet nuclear missiles on the way to target, so we can devalue or collapse Soviet ability to threaten us. And one of this came to the forefront. I spent 2 years on the National Security Council staff. The title is Deputy Executive Secretary, but U.S. government agencies have a office under the Cabinet Secretary called the Executive Secretary, which is in charge of sort of internal management and paperwork and coordination. So the NSC Exec Sec was in charge, for example, of briefing papers for the president. But as deputy, my job was presidential meetings, inbound and outbound. I mean, who was coming to see the president and what was supposed to happen, and what do we need the U.S. government to do to make it a successful meeting, and also outbound. So for inbound, you would say, look, the Japanese prime minister is coming for a state visit in 3 months. What needs to happen for that visit to be successful? What do we want to get out of this meeting? Why is he coming? I mean, there's goodwill, there's a photo, fine, but we're trying to make something happen. We're trying to fix a problem or push an agenda ahead to do something. There's a purposeful meeting. And by the way, the corollary question is, what do the Japanese want out of this? We want them to leave with a sense of success and understanding and goodwill as well. So what do they need to have happen for them to be able to deem it a success as well? And if we're good at this job, it's a win-win. We had a good meeting. They left happy. We left happy. We got something. We fixed some problem, moved something ahead, and they have the same feeling. So a series of discussions and plannings with the Japanese embassy, the Japanese foreign ministry, our internal meetings. It's been up. But to the point on SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, it was the Reykjavik Summit, which I was the NSC staff officer for. Reagan meets Gorbachev. But Gorbachev's singular request is, you've got to stop development of SDI. And by the way, to my mind, not a tech person, but to my mind, his focus on that specific request gives it away. You wouldn't ask unless there is some potency to what we're doing. You wouldn't ask, you wouldn't think this has got to stop. If you want a friendship, you want better relationships, you want to de-escalate nuclear tension, you guys need to stop this initiative. So to ask that question is to answer it. I mean, and if anything, just hearing the question being posed, you say, well, goddamn, if there's one thing we do in our whole life, we better not give this thing up, because they know what we know, that this thing can put them out of business. And so the summit, so to speak, broke down, meaning Reagan didn't agree with that proposal. Gorbachev didn't agree with any of the counter proposals. The summit broke down. But to my mind, that was a huge turning point where Gorbachev said, look, I know I'm under the gun and I'm under pressure. He didn't have the economic wherewithal to make the reforms he needed to do, But he said, if I can get the U.S. to hold off a bit, I can have some breathing room. And Reagan said, no breathing room. So that's when he started to try to make some economic reforms and some political reforms. It didn't quite work, and that really put pressure on the system. So I think the SDI and the space race, so to speak, the space program, was a huge element of the Reagan presidency. Thanks.
I'll come to you for the last question, but I have a really interesting question here from Jan online. She's wondering, in light of the drone attack on Poland recently, she's concerned about President Trump's response or lack thereof to it. How would have Reagan responded to such an attack on a NATO ally?
Well, look, my starting point is these probes are not accidental. These are not inadvertent. But this is how expansionist powers behave. This is how aggressive powers behave. Is he doesn't necessarily want a hot war, but he's looking for testing and probing and checking out. Walter Mondale, who you will recall was Jimmy Carter's vice president, metaphor, he said, you know, the Soviets are like the thief in a hotel. They will go down the hallway testing every doorknob, just saying who didn't click their door, who didn't lock the door. So it was sort of an opportunistic approach, and that's, I think, what we're seeing. Well, I can tell you exactly what Reagan's approach would be. If you don't like a certain behavior, you have to attach a cost to it. And you have to attach a cost in such a way, the verdict of the cost, is it too much, is it too little, too fast? The verdict, the evaluation of that cost is only done by the other side. It's Moscow that said, boy, this was pretty costly, we better not do it again. It's not us who say we're going to put this kind of cost on. So the question becomes is what could we do that would say somebody in Moscow to say, whatever you do, don't try that again. That didn't work out, and we paid a price for that, so don't try it again. And the U.S. responded quickly, NATO responded quickly, and the Russians got a little embarrassed or suffered. Now, I don't think that's what's happened this time. I think there was a bit of a scramble, a bit of alarm, but there was no cost attached to Russian behavior. So we might see additional probes and additional efforts.
Hi. I'm Finn. I'm a history and poli-sci major here. So one of the main areas I'll be studying is U.S. involvement in the Middle East, and I'm really interested in the U.S. going into Iraq back in the early 2000s. I was wondering, since you worked in both the Reagan and the second Bush administration, Dick Cheney was a prominent figure in
Sure.
Nixon, Ford, Bush,
Yeah.
Reagan, Bush again. But I was just wondering, you know, people refer to Cheney as like the most powerful vice president in U.S. history, and I'm just wondering, what was it like for you being in the Reagan administration and the Bush administration to kind of see him gradually gain power, and then also involvement with like Halliburton in Iraq and all that?
Yeah. Well, he was a very serious guy. He was a serious policy guy. So a lot of vice presidents are there for other reasons, not because of their depth, right? Not because, boy, if you've got a question on foreign policy, the one person you're not going to call, excuse me, I know I'm going to step on some toes, you're not going to call Kamala Harris. She wasn't there because of policy depth. She wasn't there because of her legislative record. She wasn't there because she's there because Biden said, I need political support. I think she brings political support. She said, that's fine if that's what you want. But she's not going to play a day-to-day role in presidential decision-making the way a Dick Cheney would. Right, so he had a lot of depth. The other interesting, by the way, I always thought he was a very polite guy, professional guy. I didn't have any problem with him. He was good at his job. But he was devoid of charm. He was devoid of charm. So if you want charm, you need to vote for Barack Obama, who's got enormous stage presence, enormous amount of goodwill, will let you feel good about yourself. Reagan had a fair amount of charm. Clinton was good. Cheney had no stage presence, but he was a serious policy guy. But I think people, unfortunately, draw the wrong conclusion. You know, there's a segment of the American voting population that says, I need emotional connectivity with the person who wants me to vote for them. I need that. And that allows me to feel good about that person. Well, Trump does that. And as I said, Trump does it with sort of friction or rancor. Obama does it with goodwill. Cheney couldn't do it at all. So Cheney said, you know, if you ask me a question, I'll give you an answer. But I'm not here to be your best friend, right? I'm here to work through a problem. So I think that in some respects hurt his public image, that people, I think, come to the wrong conclusion about the guy. But I think he was a very serious-minded guy, and he was hardline oriented. He was hardline oriented. He would say our security depends on our hard power, and we've got threats and problems out there, and we need to be able to push back. But I don't think he was a militarist. You know, it's interesting to me that the military professionals, when he was Secretary of Defense, the military professionals are not militarist. They can be hierarchical, they can be even conformist, they can have other personality attributes, but I've never met somebody in the Pentagon who's a warmonger who says, let's go and let them do it. So I don't think Cheney was in that category. But he was a hardline guy, and he was a very thoughtful policy analyst. Yeah, and he obviously was well regarded by 4 or 5 presidents in a row who wanted him as part of the decision-making apparatus. So I've only seen him once since he left office, and the same thing. He's a thoughtful guy. He's a guy you'd want to review questions with and say, why did this take place? Why did this take place? What did he do? And he'd give you a thoughtful response.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I've got one online. Here we go.
So my name is Abigail Smart. I'm a senior here at UNH. I'm also part of the leadership team for Model UN.
Great.
So being here in the room we actually hold Model UN meetings in with a lot of students from our team, and being a senior who is planning on trying to pursue a career in diplomacy in some kind with a strong interest in the National Security Council, I was just wondering, I'm going to ask the very basic question of what kind of advice do you have for young people who are entering this field? Are there any lessons you learned, any standout moments from your early part of your career that you'd like to share with us?
Thank you. I love this question. Look, you can kind of guess what I'm going to say, but my view is if you're at UNH, you are capable of playing in the major leagues, and you ought to think about playing in the major leagues. You ought to be aspirational, and you ought to knock on all the doors you can, and then pursue all the leads you can. And I say that because one of the problems with playing in the major leagues is it's incredibly competitive. The numbers are against you. So don't say, well, I applied to 3 places and I'm checking my mailbox. I don't know about you, but I always ran kind of scared. I just knocked on. I'd talk to everybody. I would talk to state, defense, intelligence, treasury, USTR, commerce, ag. Anybody's got an international footprint, I'd say I want to have a conversation with them. Can I fit in? Can I help? Can I be a part of this team? AID was fantastic. Peace Corps was fantastic. So any place there's a door to knock on, and I'd look at congressional roles or think tanks or journalism or grad school as well. And my one bit of advice is we say this in the stock market, don't try to time the market. Don't say, well, I know where the market's going next year, so here's what I'm going to do. Because a lot of people have an undercurrent of unhappiness about our current direction. So they're saying, look, I want to be part of the system. I want to help lead the system. I want to be part of that conversation, but I'm not comfortable with the current administration. My counter-argument is, you know what? If you wait till a sunny day comes, you are going to face 3x or 5x the competition. I would start the process now. I'd start the process, if you say it's a rainy day, I'd start the process on a rainy day. And I wouldn't wait for, I'm only going to be smart when the sun is shining, and I will withdraw from things when there's bad weather. And the process can take 1, 2, 3 years. I mean, you talk to AID professionals, it takes a long time to get through the system. And in any event, your first tour duty officer can be kind of a marginal, post someplace. It doesn't necessarily matter. So I'd say you're much better off doing what you can now to get in the system. Even if you're not 100% on board the current direction of U.S. foreign policy, you can make a difference and you can contribute. And I think you ought to do it. I think the system works because people have a voice. People have something to say, something to add, right? And if you're here at this school, you've got something to say. So say it. Good.
Okay, I want to end with one final question from George online. And he's telling us that he's a bit confused about what the actual important issues of the day are with so much chaos. He's trying to understand what 1 or 2 of the key things we should remain focused on in the international space.
I think we have most powers in the world are stable powers without territorial ambitions or other kind of international designs, but a few are not. So it doesn't matter if all of us behave well if somebody in this room has bad intent. They can ruin it for everybody else in the room. So I'd say China has some positive impulses and has some negative impulses, and how do we deflect those negative impulses, to help it be a stable member of the international community. I'd say Putin has a lot of negative impulses, and I think there are hostile powers from Cuba to Iran to North Korea that aren't as immediately as threatening as Russia or China, but still bear watching. And overlaying all of that, I think, is nuclear issues, nuclear-related issues that, you know, we had a U.S. strike on Iranian facilities. We had the Iraq war. I think this is the world we're in, which once every decade or every other decade, somebody in some country says, I'm going to develop a nuclear weapon, and I think we ought to kill Americans. And the president has to decide, is this rhetoric? Is this political posturing? Is this guy talking nonsense? Or should we take this fellow seriously? Do you want to be a minute early or be a minute late? And what is your threshold for a decision? But I think this is the world we're in. So, you know, it could be 15 years from now, the prime minister of Kazakhstan says it's time we all have to get together and hit a U.S. city with a nuclear weapon. That's my goal. And I won't be around. You guys decide, do you want to do something about it or not? But that's a huge part of U.S. government decision-making, is that crisis management, threat management.
Well, hopefully we're certainly not a minute late in any nuclear strikes. But please join me in thanking Ambassador Lavin for joining us here tonight. Thank you to the University of New Hampshire for their support. Thank you to Access Coach for their sponsorship of tonight's event as well. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like, we are selling the ambassador's books here. I'm sure he'd be willing to sign it for you as well. And thank you so much. We hope to see you at future events. And thank you to our online audience as well. Have a great night.